We're shining the spotlight on the best chess player ever, Bobby Fischer, and how after e5, best by test, he crushes the Caro-Kann Defense, an incredibly solid opening where black plays c6, planning to contest the center with d5. He does it with knight c3, defending his pawn, so that after black goes for d5 attacking it, he can play knight f3, the two knights attack. This stops black from pushing his pawn and prioritizes rapid development while remaining flexible with his d-pawn. Grandmaster Benko goes for bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen while getting it out of the way of the pawn chain. Fischer pushes h3, prompting black to grab the knight, inviting white's queen into the game. Black then develops his knight, pressuring white's center that he defends with his pawn, and black plays e6, solidifying his own center. With the e-pawn in its way, Fischer plays g3, opening up a different square for his bishop's development, and black's bishop pins the white knight. With d4 incoming, white breaks the pin immediately with his bishop, and black pushes d4 anyway, kicking the knight back to b1. Black lifts his queen to b6, defending his bishop, while threatening to take white's bishop with a check, opening up an attack on the b2 pawn. So white plays b3, stopping that threat, and black's a5 gains queenside space. Fischer pushes a3, hitting the bishop, who decides now to capture on d2. White takes back, and queen c5 hits the c-pawn. So white drops his queen back defending. Black's h5 gains kingside space, and white stops further advances with h4. Both sides proceed to develop their final minor pieces, and then black jumps his knight to g4, putting constant and irritating pressure on white's kingside. White can't even kick the knight out because a move like f3 would be met by knight to e3, which would hit just about everything. So instead of f3, Fischer just castles, leaving the knight alone, and black lunges with g5. Now white absolutely can't let black take on h4, because after he'd recapture, things would get very dangerous with the open g-file. So Fischer counters with b4, hitting black's queen, who drops the e7. Then he jumps his knight to f3, so that after black takes the pawn on h4, he can recapture with his knight, keeping things closed. Black centralizes his other knight, putting pressure on white's position. And after Fischer lifts his queen prepared to jump forward, black shifts his rook, peering at the enemy king. Fischer jumps his queen to f4, potentially threatening to play f3 to remove the defender of the knight on e5. So black plays f6, defending his knight, and white takes on a5, opening up the queen side and pretty much telling black that he can't castle there. Black recaptures with his rook, and white swings his other rook to the b-file, hitting the b7 pawn. This would mean that even though the a3 pawn is hanging, if black were to take it, white would take back, luring the black queen away from the defense of the b7 pawn, which he would take next. So going back, instead of taking the pawn, black pushes b5, saving his own pawn. Even though his a-pawn is still under attack, Fischer drops his knight back, hitting the d-pawn, which black defends with his rook. Then he moves his bishop to h3, where it's far more active than it was on g2. But the bishop no longer protects the knight, so black snatches it, luring the white queen a step backwards after she recaptures. Then black lifts his king off the back rank to defend his pawns, and after white cautiously lifts his king as well, black's queen is no longer stuck defending the pawn, and is freed up to move to the g-file. Fischer counters with rook b4, hitting both the rook and the d-pawn. Now white wants to take that rook to open up the b-file so that he can exploit it with his rook. So black swings his other rook over to a4, allowing him to meet the capture with a rook recapture to keep the b-file closed. Then Fischer takes the knight, and after the recapture he dodges his queen to f4, having withstood consistent pressure on his king side this whole time. Now Fischer is planning to swing his rook over to the open h-file, so black needs to get ready for that. He drops his rook back to a8, and white plays rook h1. Now black cannot directly contest the file because white would take the rook, luring the queen away from the defense of the g-pawn, which white would take. So going back, black instead slides his rook over to g8, protecting his pawn in anticipation of white's possible next move, rook to h4. But Fischer switches the attention again to the other end with a potent pawn sacrifice, a4. He's trying to get an open file for his rook on the queen side, and the only way for black to stop that would be b4. But then white would get a passed pawn. So black decides to take the a-pawn. And at this point, white has a brilliant winning plan. Can you find it? To find the move, you can notice that the b file is completely open. And with white's queen guarding the b8 square, there's no way for black to contest it. So the move Fischer plays to win the game is rook b1, and it's pretty much all over. The threat isn't just rook b7 skewering the king and queen, but let's say black would move his queen out of the way, white would play rook b7 check, forcing the king to the back rank, and it wouldn't matter which square, queen b8 would be checkmate. Going back, so black can't save his queen. He actually has to deal with the checkmate threat, and the best way to do that would be e5, blocking the white queen's diagonal. But then comes rook b7 check anyways, and once the king moves, white grabs the queen. Even though black gets the queen back, the rook is hanging, and white takes that, going up material. The game goes on a couple moves since black still does have the passed a-pawn, but he resigns after white's rook b8 that cuts the king off, because even if the black pawn were to go, white's rook could eventually swoop over and pick it up. This leads us to our second opponent, Grandmaster William Addison, and he meets the two knights attack by capturing on e4. Fischer recaptures with his knight, and after black develops his knight challenging it, he takes it. Black recaptures with his e-pawn, opening up his bishop, and Fischer plays his famous bishop c4, putting pressure on the frail f7. After black's bishop d6, white lifts his queen to e2, checking the king, and black blocks with his queen, leading to an exchange of queens and the black king recapturing on e7. Fischer follows with d4, putting a pawn in the center, and black develops his second bishop, hitting the c2 pawn. White drops his bishop back defending, and black slides his rook over to e8, looking to artificially castle his king. White lifts his bishop to e3, blocking the e-file, and after black drops his king, white castles queenside. Black develops his final minor piece, and even with his king on c8, white pushes the explosive c4, getting control over the center. Black centralizes his rook, and with the pawn now in its way, Fischer drops his bishop back, challenging black's strong bishop. They're exchanged, and the king recaptures before black pushes f5, looking to push f4, and then to slot his rook onto the second rank. In anticipation of this, white slides his rook over to contest the e-file, and after f4, white drops his bishop back, opening up the rooks to one another. Black doesn't react, calmly activating his knight on f6, and Fischer proceeds to jump his knight into the center, blocking the black bishop's defense of the f4 pawn. So black plays g5, defending it. Then white plays f3, boxing out the enemy knight. Black follows with knight h5, preparing f3 to kick white's knight, so white preemptively drops it to g4. With this last move, black will have trouble returning his knight into the game, so he lifts his king to g7, defending that square. This prompts Fischer to lift his bishop to c3, peering the enemy king. So black advances him again to g6. Then white exchanges rooks before pushing c5 to kick the black bishop back. Then he pushes d5, and if black doesn't do anything, white will get a powerful passed pawn. Now black only has one move here that keeps the game equal, and that's to play f5. He needs to first kick the knight back before taking the pawn in the center, and we'll see exactly why in a second. Instead, he takes on d5 right away, and white recaptures with the rook. Now black plays f5, but it's too late because white's rook is protecting the e5 square. This allows white to jump his knight forward instead of backwards with a check, and black pretty much has to take the knight. He can't move along this diagonal because it would allow for discovered check opportunities, and going to h6 would allow knight f7 check, pushing the king back to g6, and knight h8, forcing the king back to h6 and away from the defense of the f5 pawn, which he will pick up next. Back to the game. So black takes the knight, and Fischer recaptures with the rook, attacking black's rook. And black probably should move his rook, but white would eventually get his rook onto the 7th rank with a lot of activity. So black instead drops his knight back, defending his rook, and white is quick to exchange them. White now has a 3-on-2 pawn majority on the queen side, and his plan will be creating a passed pawn on that side. Meanwhile, black's doubled pawns make it difficult for him to do anything similar on the king side. Also, white's bishop is superior than black's knight in this endgame with pawns on both sides of the board, since the bishop has more range. Fischer immediately starts showing off the power of his bishop, with bishop to e5 completely taking the black knight out of the game by covering all of its escape squares. Black advances his king, and so does white. Then, out of desperation, black goes for g4 because, well, there isn't a good way for him to stop white's queenside pawns, so he's trying to create a passed pawn on the king side. White starts pushing with b4, and black's a6 tries to stop that. White goes for a4, and black takes on f3, and white takes back. Then black advances his king to h4, trying to hunt down the h2 pawn. Fischer advances on the other end with b5, one step closer to getting an unstoppable passed pawn. Black has to react because otherwise white's going to take on a6, and after the recapture, his c-pawn would be passed. So black takes, and white pushes a5 with a deadly plan. After black's king to h3, about to pick up the h-pawn, white has a move that wins the game on the spot. Can you find the winning move? To find the move, we notice that black's b-pawn is overloaded, covering both the white c-pawn's path and the white a-pawn's path forward. So white's idea will be to sacrifice one of his pawns to deflect the b-pawn. Now the black knight covers the c7 square, so black could sacrifice his knight for the pawn. This means Fischer chooses to sacrifice his c-pawn to deflect the b-pawn, and this prompts black to resign the game. His knight can't move without getting captured, so he can't stop the a-pawn, and either white's going to take the b-pawn next and promote, or black would take the c-pawn, giving white's a-pawn a free path towards promotion. Next, the third opponent is Grandmaster Friedrich Olafsson, and he meets the two knights attack with knight f6. Fischer pushes his pawn, hitting white's knight, who jumps forward to e4. Now, were white to take the knight, black would recapture, kicking white's knight, and even though he'll probably lose his e-pawn, queen d4 would certainly win white's e-pawn in return. So, going back, white doesn't take the knight, instead dropping his back to e2, and black lifts his queen to b6. Fischer advances in the center with d4, opening up his queenside while securing his advanced pawn. But black is quick to undermine it with c5. White takes that, opening up the d4 square, so that after black takes back, he can jump his knight onto a powerful post on d4. Black challenges it, and white pins that knight to the king with his bishop. After a6, he snatches the knight and the pawn recaptures before white castles his king to safety. Then black drops his queen, pressuring the b-pawn and preparing to push c5 to kick the white knight. But Fischer plays the bothersome move e6, giving away the pawn. And were black to take it with the bishop, there would be a similar outcome after white would take it. So instead, black just takes immediately with the pawn, weakening the king side, while making it very difficult for him to develop his bishop on this diagonal. White, on the other hand, easily gets his bishop out, taking full control over the center, and black resorts to g6, opening up a new path for development. But Fischer does no favors, immediately moving his bishop to e5, using the new diagonal to hit the rook. Black blocks with his knight, and white jumps his other knight forward, adding an attacker to e6. The thing is, it's incredibly difficult for black to defend the pawn. The king can't move because one square is blocked off by the knight, and were it to go to the other square, it would block the bishop. c5 wouldn't even work either, opening up the queen, because white would take on e6 anyways, and after black would take back, he would take the knight, opening up the e-file. After the recapture, they would let him take the bishop, and white wouldn't be able to take back with the queen without losing it to a pin by the rook. Back to the game, so black lets his e-pawn go, with bishop h6 hitting the knight, and Fischer takes on e6. Black takes the g5 knight to lure the white knight away from the king side, and after white recaptures, black is able to castle. Now, there's pressure by the black rook and the queen on the f-pawn, so white should not move his f-rook. He lifts his queen, opening up the path for his other rook, and after bishop f5, he slides his rook to e1. After black centralizes his rook, white drops his bishop back, opening up an attack on the e7 pawn. So black lifts his rook to defend it. Fischer slots his knight onto e6, hitting black's rook. So black takes it and white recaptures with his rook, blockading black's weak pawn. Black then pushes his pawn, hitting white's bishop, while opening up the d4 square for his knight. The bishop moves, adding an attacker to the weak e-pawn, and black counters with knight d5, both attacking and defending. The bishop drops a square, and black lifts his rook to f7, overprotecting his pawn. Fischer follows with g3, giving his king some luft, but with the f3 square now weakened, black starts maneuvering his knight towards it. Knight c7 hits the rook, who drops to e5. Then for a second it goes back to d5. White lifts his queen looking at the c4 square, and after black's knight moves to f6, white plays queen c4, pinning the rook to the king. The black knight carries on its journey with an attack on the rook, who goes right back to e6, adding an attacker to the c6 pawn. Now black actually can't save the pawn. It's pinned, so it can't move, and trying to defend it, let's say with his rook, would loosen up the d4 pawn, and rook to e4 would fork the pawn and the knight, forcibly winning it. So, black instead goes for queen b5, hoping at the very least to defend a pawn down endgame where white to exchange queens. Fischer does grab the queen, and after black recaptures, he takes the pawn. Then black jumps his knight to e5, hitting the rook, who runs to c8, checking the king. He dodges to g7. Fischer lifts his bishop to b4, giving it a path back to the game, and black completes his knight's journey with knight f3 check. The king dodges to g2, and black pushes e5, solidifying his advanced pawn. White slides his rook over to d1, pressuring the pawn, and black pushes g5, trying to secure his knight. But it's too late for any of that. Fischer launches his bishop to f8 with check, and black takes it, leading to an exchange of rooks. But now that the knight is undefended, after black takes it, white wins the knight back. Fischer's managed to exchange almost all of the pieces, and he just has a pawn up endgame. But there's still some work to do. Black lifts his king up to f7, and white plays c3, exploiting the pin on the d-pawn to the rook. Black shouldn't push his pawn forward because then it'd be too weak and white would pick it off with his king. So instead, black advances his king. But he's still about to lose a pawn, and were white to go up 2 pawns, he'd easily win the game. But it's not so easy. Can you find how white can win a pawn? To find the only move that wins the pawn, you can notice that black's pawns are overextended, and with the help of his king and a little thing called opposition, white can win it. The move Fischer plays is pawn takes d4. If black takes with the rook, the outcome would be similar, because white would just exchange them. So black takes with the pawn, and the winning move here is king to e4, adding a second attacker to the overextended weak pawn, and also not allowing black's king forward. White's gonna win the pawn in a second, so black tries rook to f7, attacking the f-pawn. But Fischer just plays f3, saving the pawn, and soon he's gonna be 2 pawns up in a completely winning endgame. So black decides at this point to resign the game. That makes 3 wins for Fischer, and the 4th opponent is Alan Benson, who meets the 2 knights attack with bishop g4. Fischer plays a6, prompting black to take the knight, and white recaptures with the queen. Black develops his knight to f6, and white prioritizes development with d4, opening up his queenside bishop. Black takes the pawn, white recaptures with the knight, leading to an exchange, and the queen landing on e4. Then black develops his knight, and white brings his bishop out to d3, before black moves his knight again to f6, hitting the queen. Fischer swings her over to h4, keeping her in the game. Black plays e6, opening up his bishop, and white castles. Then black jumps his knight to d5, opening up the queens to one another. And white dodges the exchange with queen g3, making it difficult for black to develop his bishop without dropping his g-pawn. Black is persistent with the queen exchange offers, but white shifts her again. Then black develops his final minor piece. Fischer pushes c3, solidifying his center, and black plays switcheroo, not castling kingside, but castling queenside. This prompts an immediate a5, storming the queenside. Black goes for bishop f4, trying to exchange off some pieces, and white plays c4 to deflect the knight away from the bishop's defense. This pretty much forces black to take the bishop, and white grabs the knight in return. Now black here should grab the b pawn with his bishop, but white would be okay with that after rook b1 with an opened up queenside and a strong attack. Instead, black backs up his bishop. Fischer promptly grabs the pawn on c6, looking to open up the c file. And things aren't looking good for black. If he takes back the pawn, then bishop to a6 would come. The king wouldn't be able to go to d7 because it would hang the f7 pawn by blocking the queen's defense. And going to b8 would invite rook to a3 and possibly rook to b3 or rook to c3, which would mean a lot of trouble. Going back, taking the pawn here with the queen isn't great either because of bishop to e4, and after she'd move, rook a3 again would create a promising attack with rook to b3 or rook to c3 incoming. Back to the game. So black grabs the pawn on d4 instead, which is his best move. But this allows Fischer to completely open up the queen side with pawn takes b7. Now black's best move here is to hide his king behind the umbrella pawn with king to b8. White would still be better though with the extra pawn. Instead, black runs his king out into the open with king to d8. White slides his rook over, peering at the enemy king, and he's planning to move his bishop out of the way. So black keeps on running with his king while opening up his rook's path to stop white's pawn from promoting. Fischer moves his bishop to a6, protecting his pawn and freeing up his queen while opening up the rooks to one another. Now black's best move here would be to exchange rooks, but even that is no good because white would recapture with his rook, getting full control over the open d file. Then his threat would be bishop to b5 and rook to d7, which would win black's queen. Black might try a move like rook to d8, contesting the open file, but then white would have queen to a3 check, and things would get really bad. Black wouldn't be able to go back because bishop b5 would trap the king, and black would have to give up material to stop the checkmate. Otherwise, going forward would lead to an exchange of rooks, then the white queen coming in with check, before moving forward to force his pawn's path to promotion. So, going all the way back, instead of all of this, black slides his rook over to b4, getting behind white's passed pawn. And Fischer quickly swings his rook over to a3, pinning the rook. And it's pretty much all over. Black plays queen c5 before resigning the game. And it's because he's going to lose material soon. White's already up a pawn, and a valuable pawn at that, that's one square away from promotion. And he's about to continue rook to d3, and either rook to c3 to kick the queen away from the rook's defense, or even rook to b3 to pile up on the pinned rook. And white's going to win material inevitably. So it's just all over. But the next game starts similarly to the last, with Leslie Hunter Weeks meeting the two knights attack with bishop g4, then h3, and the white queen entering the game. Black goes e6, and Fischer pushes d4, opening up his queenside bishop. After black develops his knight pressuring the center, white develops his bishop to d3, defending the pawn. Then black takes on e4, leading to an exchange of knights, and the white bishop landing on e4. Black develops his knight and white castles before black develops his bishop, looking to do the same. Fischer quickly swings his rook to d1 in line with the enemy queen, and after black castles, he plays the explosive c4, preparing a central pawn break. Black's knight f6 kicks the bishop back to c2, and then black moves his queen out of the white rook's line. So white develops his bishop to f4, chasing after her, and after black blocks it with his bishop, white moves his bishop again to g5, adding an attacker to the now once less defended knight. This makes black clumsily drop his bishop back, defending his knight. Fischer swings his other rook over to c1, in line with the queen, and black slides his rook over to the semi-open d file. White moves his bishop to b3, preparing an advance on d5. And after black lifts his rook, trying to double up on the d file to stop that, white quickly strikes with d5. Black takes once, and after white recaptures, he can't take again because of the pin on the c pawn to the queen. so he doubles up on the d-file with his rooks. Fischer captures on c6, opening the rooks to each other, and black takes on d1 with check. Now white wants to keep his rook in line with the enemy queen, so he recaptures with the bishop. Then black takes on c6, getting a weak isolated pawn. White can't take it just yet, however, because then his bishop would be hanging. So instead of that, black moves his bishop out of the way to b3, and black pushes his pawn to c5 where it's defended by his bishop. Fischer drops his bishop back to e3, adding an attacker to the pawn, but it's defended enough for now. So black plays h6, giving his king luft. White follows with queen f5, not only piling up on the pawn, but creating another more serious threat. Let's say black would defend the pawn with his rook. Then white would play the crushing queen g6, exploiting the pin on the f pawn to the king. This would threaten both the f7 pawn and the h6 pawn thanks to the pin on the g pawn to the king, and it would be impossible for black to defend both of the pawns. So, going back, instead of protecting his pawn, black shifts his king to f8, getting out of the pin, and white grabs the pawn on c5, going up a pawn. Now, even though it looks like white's bishop's in a dangerous pin, black can't exploit the pin because white can always take on e7 with a check. So black grabs the bishop, and Fischer recaptures with his rook, hitting the queen, who sidesteps to d7, offering an exchange. Now, even though he's up a pawn, if white were to trade queens, black would recapture with the rook, getting a lot of counterplay with his rook on the open d-file. So instead of taking, white drops his queen a square, and black remains persistent with the exchange offers. Fischer slides his queen over to c4, threatening a checkmate on f7, which black defends with his rook. Then white swoops his rook into the back rank, giving check. Black's only choice here is to block with his knight. Then white calmly plays g3, giving his king some more air, before black plays rook c7, trying to free himself from white's stranglehold. Fischer moves his bishop to a4, piling up on the pinned knight. Since were black to grab the queen, then rook takes e8 would be checkmate. So, black takes the rook instead, and white recaptures with the queen, threatening again a checkmate on e8. Black lifts his queen to e5, defending the knight. Now, with the opportunity to exchange into a king and pawn endgame, up a pawn, Fischer grabs the knight with his queen, forcing black to exchange queens along with every other piece. And now it's easy for white to win. He advances his king, and so does black, and then eventually, black decides at this point to resign the game. The win would be pretty straightforward from here. White could advance his queenside pawn majority, but if black were to try to run his king to stop that, then white would start advancing his kingside pawns. Eventually, his pawns would get really far up, and either black would have to make a choice. He could back his king up, but then white would shoulder him off. And then if black were to try to run and win the kingside pawns, it would be too late, because white's pawns would be advanced enough, and he would certainly win that race. So, will our sixth opponent, Grandmaster Szymon Kagan, have better luck when he meets the two knights attack, again with the most common bishop g4. After a6 and the exchange of pieces, black plays knight f6, pressuring e4. White plays d3, defending the pawn, and black's e6 opens up his kingside. White plays a3, stopping black's bishop from landing on b4, and black develops his knight before white bursts out g4, expanding on the kingside. After black's bishop d6, Fischer strikes with g5, kicking the knight all the way back home. Then h4 gains even more space on the king side. Black redevelops his knight, and white carries on pressuring with h4. Seeing danger on the king side, black advances his queen to b6, opening a lane on the other end. After white develops his bishop to h3, black castles queenside. And right on cue, Fischer advances on the queen side with a4. Black pushes a5, stopping any further advances, and white castles kingside, despite having pushed his pawns so far up the board. Black slides his rook over to f8, preparing an advance, and white cautiously shifts his king to the corner. After black's f5, white drops his queen out of the black rook's way. And black shouldn't take the pawn here, because white would recapture, and the e6 pawn here would be pretty weak. So instead, black plays g6, solidifying his f-pawn. Fischer pushes h6, closing up the king side, and black cautiously shifts his king to b8. Then white pushes f4, preparing to completely lock up the kingside with e5. And here black should really take on e4 to prevent that closing of the position, but he instead moves his rook over to e8. White jumps at the chance to lock things up with e5, and now despite the white kingside pawns having advanced so far forward, the closed position leaves his king pretty safe. Black saves his bishop, and Fischer lifts his queen with a long-term idea of activating it along the third rank. With the kingside position closed, black starts maneuvering his pieces towards the queen side, and white does similar with bishop g2 aimed at the long diagonal. Black moves his king to c7, making way for his other knight, and white drops his knight to e2, getting out of the way of his pawns. Black drops his knight to b8, looking to reroute it towards the queen side. And Fischer proceeds with c3, looking to push either b4 or c4. With the queen side opening up, black starts running his king away from it. White develops his bishop, and after black jumps his knight to a6, white slides his rook over to the queen side. In anticipation of a potential b4, black drops his bishop all the way back, and next comes b4. Fischer here is sacrificing a pawn. Black takes it, and white takes back. Now black should not take again, even though the pawn is hanging, but white is going to storm through and break open the queen side if black sits back. So black grabs the pawn with his bishop, which is a mistake. With the black a-pawn out of the way, white pushes a5, trying to deflect the queen away from the defense of the bishop. But black must be thinking that he could keep defending it with queen to c5. Fischer pushes d4, hitting her again, and she retreats all the way to f8, keeping an eye on the bishop. Then white grabs the bishop, and black recaptures with the knight, before white swings his queen over to c3, adding an attacker to the knight. There's no more pieces that can defend it, so it drops to a6, and with the b-file now semi-open, the white rook swoops in to capture the b7 pawn with check. The only defense for black here is knight c7, and it's more or less game over. Fischer drops his knight to c1, looking to jump it forward to b3 and then to c5 with a devastating check that would force the king away from the defense of the knight. In light of this, black moves his rook to e7, opening up a square for his king to run to, while indirectly defending the knight. But after Fischer's a6, black resigns. White can simply push his pawn all the way to the end, and black's going to have to give up material for the pawn, which would give white the decisive advantage. This takes us to the penultimate opponent, Gary Bookout, who follows as usual with bishop g4, but after the pieces are exchanged and the queen enters the game, black develops his queenside knight to d7. This is a mistake because it immediately puts him on the back foot as the queen no longer protects the d-pawn, and Fischer can win a pawn by capturing. Black decides not to recapture since he's losing a pawn anyway, instead developing his second knight, and white captures again before black jumps his knight to e5, forking the queen and the pawn. Fischer moves his queen out of the way, and black recaptures the pawn with his knight, which is immediately pinned by white's bishop. There isn't much black can do about the pin just yet, so he plays g6, planning to deploy his bishop on the long diagonal, and after white castles, black does just that. Then white slides his rook over to the d-file, preparing a central pawn advance, and black castles, unpinning his knight. Fischer grabs the knight right away, weakening black's pawn structure after he recaptures, while also weakening black's control over the d4 square, allowing white to grab the center while opening up his queenside bishop. Black then goes for knight h5, hitting the queen, while opening up a second attacker onto the d4 pawn. The queen swings over to d3, defending its pawn, and black plays e6, making sure white cannot push his weak pawn forward. Fischer develops his bishop to e3, solidifying his pawn, and black develops his queen to c7, opening up the square for his rook. Then white moves his knight, making way for his c-pawn, and after black slides his rook over to d8, white pushes c3, securing the pawn. Black then jumps his knight to f4, hitting the white queen. She slides over to c4, and black hops his knight to a powerful post on d5. Now white has a pawn majority here on the queen side, which means in an endgame he could create a passed pawn on that side of the board. So Fischer starts pushing with b4. Black plays a6, trying to stop the pawns from advancing more, but white advances with a4 next. Black then moves his queen to b7 on the semi-open file to stop a potential b5 advance, but she gets hit right away by white's knight. She clumsily moves forward, and the knight drops for a second, looking at the a5 square to potentially pile up on the c pawn. Then black drops his bishop, where it's fighting for the c5 square. Fischer slides his rook over to c1, where in the future it could potentially become more active, and black similarly moves his rook over to c8. But this weakens the a6 pawn, so white jumps his knight right back to c5, adding an attacker to the pawn. Black drops his knight to c7, defending it, and as black takes another step backwards, white takes another step forward, with bishop g5 hitting the rook. Black advances it to d5, and white drops his knight to e4, threatening a devastating fork on f6. So black drops his knight to e8, defending that square. Fischer slots his knight into f6 anyway, leading to an exchange of pieces, and the white bishop suffocating the black king. Then black, succumbing to immense pressure on the queen side, decides to break with c5. But this lets white just win a pawn with an attack on the queen. At the very least, black moves his queen to the now vacated c6 square, where she's more active, along with an attack on the a4 pawn, who quickly pushes forward out of the way. Then black slides his rook over to the semi-open b file. Now he's up 2 pawns, so Fischer grabs the rook on d5, exchanging some pieces, while also giving black a weak isolated d-pawn after he recaptures. He blockades it with his queen, and since white's bishop covers the d8 square, black lifts his rook to b7 so that it can slide over to d7 and defend his pawn. Then white slides his rook over to the open e file, and black plays h5, giving his king some air. White plays h4 himself just to constrict black's position as much as possible, and black slides his rook over to d7. Fischer swoops his rook into e8, paralyzing the last of black's pieces. And here black really can't do anything to make any progress. He clumsily moves his queen back, and here white has an absolutely brilliant move. Bishop to e7. This sacrifices his full bishop. The threat is to take the pinned black bishop, which means black is forced to deal with this, and at the same time the bishop has gotten out of the way of the white queen. This means that were black to take the bishop, then white would sacrifice the rook for black's bishop, and were black to take that rook, then queen to h8 would be checkmate. Otherwise, if the black king were to play the only other option, king to h7, then queen to h8 would still be checkmate. It's hopeless because black has no good options to defend. So going back, he tries f6 instead of taking the bishop, and Fischer takes the pawn, giving him the unstoppable threat of taking the bishop with his rook and then playing queen to h8 checkmate. This prompts black to resign the game. And if by now you aren't sure about the two knights attack, then the final game might prove the opening's power, with Vasily Panov meeting it by capturing the pawn. Fischer recaptures, centralizing his knight, which black immediately challenges with knight f6. Now white does not want to retreat his knight because it would give black the free hand to make any move he likes. So white captures the knights, doubling black's pawns after he recaptures. Fischer proceeds by developing his bishop to c4, eyeing up the soft f7, and black develops his bishop to d6. Then both sides castle their kings to safety. White thrusts forward in the center with d4 while opening up his bishop, and black places his bishop onto e6. White sees the opportunity here to create a weakness in black's position, and he does so by capturing black's bishop. This does undouble black's pawns once he recaptures, but the pawn on e6 cannot be defended by other pawns, and after white's next move, rook to e1 attacking it, it becomes difficult for black to push it in order to get rid of it. Black defends it with rook to e8. Fischer gains even more space in the center with c4, and black develops his final minor piece with knight a6, planning to land the knight on b4. White moves his bishop to d2, stopping that, and planning to move it along the long diagonal. After black plays queen d7, connecting his rooks and solidifying his weak e6 pawn, white moves his bishop to c3, where it can spring to life after a potential d5 break. Black decides to eliminate this possibility right away with bishop b4 hitting the bishop. White's queen b3 is a way to force black's decision by attacking the bishop a second time while also indirectly pressuring black's queen side. Black takes the bishop, and white recaptures with the pawn, not only securing his powerful central pawn, but also opening up the b file for his rook. Then black reroutes his knight towards the center with knight c7. And if you thought to take the hanging b7 pawn, you'd be in for a dreadful shock, as rook e to b8 would trap the queen with the knight covering the a6 square. Fischer of course sees this, so he doesn't take the pawn. He plays a4 to prevent black from breaking through on the queen side with b5. Now white might carry on with a5 in order to capture en passant were black to play b5. So black plays b6 in order to meet white's a5 with b5, preventing the en passant opportunity. White takes this moment to play h3, creating luft for his king, and black shifts his rook to b8, preparing his b5 pawn break. Black's plan is still a number of moves away, so white decides to shift his sights on a more fruitful target. Rook e4 not only aims to double up rooks on the weakened e6 pawn, but also to eventually shift his rook over to the h-file, where it could wreak havoc on black's king side. Black carries on mechanically with a6 to support a b5 pawn break, and white drops his queen to c2, aiming to coordinate with his rook on h7 at some point. Black finally plays b5. Several pawns are exchanged, and black avoids capturing with a piece because it could allow white to play c4 with tempo, so he captures with the b pawn. At this point, black will surely have tons of activity on the queen side, but Fischer has different ideas in mind. He maneuvers his knight to d2, where it will soon leap into the center. Black slides his rook over to contest the open a-file, but white moves his rook over from a to e1, focusing on the center. Black's queen to d5 here is a good move, with the idea of moving it to f5 to defend the diagonal from white's queen. After white swings his rook over to h4, opening up two attackers onto the h7 pawn, black cuts off the white queen's attack with queen to f5 and hopes for an exchange. White's knight jumps to e4, stopping the trade and potentially setting up some tactics on the king side. Now white's knight here is pinned to the queen, so black plays e5, aiming to open up the e-file and build up pressure on the knight. But this was a big mistake. The e-pawn was defending the queen, but now she is loose. And those tactics I was talking about earlier, well, knight f6 here would open up a discovered attack on the queen while checking the king. But black would just take the knight with his queen. And even though white would get to take on h7 with check, there isn't really a good attack to follow. White would wish there would be a rook on f3 to pin the queen to the king. Back to the game. There actually is one winning move here for white. Can you find that one and only winning move? Fischer has the exact right idea, and hopefully you did too. The move white plays is rook to e3. Rook to f3 is coming, and it's unstoppable. Black plays h6 to at least stop white from capturing the pawn on h7. White moves his rook one square to f3, hitting the queen, who hastily flees to h7, where the king can defend her in case of discovered attacks. White takes on f6 anyway with his knight, and with everything under fire, black has no choice but to recapture the knight. Then white's rook promptly exploits the open g-file, giving check, and the king slides over to still protect his queen. Fischer's final blow is rook to g6, and white will take on h6 next with either of his rooks, which would win the queen and the game. So, black resigns.